You begin with an assumption so familiar that you rarely notice it, the belief that what you know is true simply because it feels coherent. You trust your judgments because they appear consistent with your experience, and you treat this internal consistency as a sign of reliability. Yet Al-Ghazali interrupts this quiet confidence. He asks whether the mind can ever guarantee the truth of its conclusions when those conclusions arise from the very structure the mind cannot step outside of. You see that certainty may not be the result of knowledge but the habit of trusting a tool that cannot evaluate itself. This raises a fundamental question. If certainty depends on the mind's own approval, what stands outside the mind to confirm that approval? Al-Ghazali lived in an environment shaped by intense intellectual competition. Baghdad of the 11th century hosted jurists who refined legal reasoning, theologians who defended doctrine, philosophers who pushed rational inquiry, and mystics who sought inner transformation. Each group believed its method led to truth, and each criticized the others with equal precision. This diversity of arguments did not resolve the search for certainty, it complicated it. The very brilliance of the environment forced Al-Ghazali to question whether any system could claim authority without investigating the reliability of human understanding itself. Al-Ghazali recognized a disturbing possibility. The intellect can affirm what is false with the same confidence it uses to affirm what is true. You begin to see this danger when you examine how easily you justify your own assumptions. The mind confirms itself through circular reasoning, trusting its conclusions because they fit the framework it already accepts. This realization weakened Al-Ghazali's confidence in logic as the unquestioned foundation of truth. If every school of thought believes it is correct, not because of external verification but because its reasoning appears coherent to itself, then coherence cannot guarantee reality. If the intellect cannot prove its own reliability, what basis remains for certainty? You often imagine that your beliefs are the result of deliberate thought. You review evidence, evaluate arguments, and conclude that your position is justified. But Al-Ghazali points to an earlier stage of the process, one you rarely notice. Before you examine evidence, you already incline toward what feels familiar or preserves your sense of stability. This inclination shapes not only what you accept but also what you are willing to consider. The mind protects itself before it reasons. Pain disrupts this protection. When your assumptions fail to align with reality, discomfort emerges. That discomfort exposes the invisible habits guiding your thinking. You begin to question whether you have been seeking truth or simply preserving an internal order that feels safe. Pain interrupts this cycle of self-confirmation, compelling you to look at the mind's tendency to defend its own patterns. If your conclusions grow out of pre-rational preference, can you still treat them as knowledge? Al-Ghazali did not treat doubt as a threat. He saw it as a discipline capable of purifying the intellect. Doubt, in his understanding, is not the rejection of truth but the refusal to accept inherited certainty without examining the foundation beneath it. When you doubt sincerely, you are not attacking knowledge. You are removing the assumptions that prevent knowledge from appearing clearly. This is where pain becomes meaningful. Discomfort is often the signal that an unexamined assumption has been challenged. The tension you feel is not merely emotional. It reveals the moment when your reasoning conflicts with the structure of ideas you have relied on. Instead of avoiding this tension, Al-Ghazali allowed it to sharpen his inquiry. He recognized that doubt forces the intellect to abandon its protective habits and confront the possibility that it might be mistaken. Doubt clears the ground so that understanding can emerge without distortion. But if deeper certainty requires doubt, why do you fear the very process that leads to clarity? As Al-Ghazali examined his own thinking, he discovered that the greatest obstacle was not logic but the self that used logic to secure its identity. You assume your viewpoint is neutral. You believe your reasoning is objective. But beneath this confidence lies a subtle impulse, the desire to maintain the idea of who you believe yourself to be. The self interprets information in ways that support its preferred image, and it rejects anything that threatens that stability. You call this process reasoning, but often it is self-preservation disguised as clarity. Pain threatens this constructed center. When your beliefs no longer match your experience, discomfort exposes the fragility of the identity you rely on. The collapse of an assumption feels personal because the self has tied its stability to its beliefs. Al-Ghazali recognized that until this false center is exposed, the intellect cannot function without bias. The mind becomes a tool for defending identity rather than discovering truth. If the self is the primary source of distortion, who is the one attempting to remove the distortion? Fear operates quietly within thought. You fear being wrong because being wrong threatens the structure you call yourself. This fear influences what you examine, what you avoid, and what you prematurely accept. It shapes which arguments seem persuasive and which ones you resist. You rarely recognize fear as an intellectual force because it expresses itself through preferences that appear rational. Pain exposes these hidden fears. When stability is shaken, you see how much of your confidence depends on what you hope will remain unchallenged. Al-Ghazali understood that fear distorts perception by narrowing the field of inquiry. When fear loosens, the mind becomes capable of asking questions it previously avoided. Perception becomes clearer not by adding new information but by removing the distortions created by fear. The more willing you are to confront discomfort, the more open you become to understanding that does not serve the self. If perception is shaped by what you fear, how can you trust what you perceive? Al-Ghazali eventually shifted the focus of his inquiry. Instead of asking which system of thought was correct, he began examining the nature of thought itself. He realized that debates between scholars often arise from differences in starting points rather than conclusions. If the premises are unexamined, even the most sophisticated reasoning cannot guarantee truth. The intellect must therefore question its own roots, not just its outcomes. Pain played a crucial role in this shift. Discomfort signaled the collapse of ideas he once trusted, forcing him to investigate the assumptions beneath them. You experience this same turning point when you trace a belief back to its origin and recognize that its certainty was inherited rather than discovered. When you examine the roots of thought, you discover that many positions you treat as knowledge are merely habits of interpretation. The deeper inquiry begins only when you stop defending inherited assumptions and start questioning the structure that produced them. If the root is uncertain, how can the branches claim clarity? Al-Ghazali pushed reason to its limit. He examined perception, memory, inference, and logical necessity. He tested every faculty the mind relies upon. Eventually, he reached a point where reason acknowledged its own boundaries. Reason could analyze, distinguish, and critique, but it could not justify its own authority. It could not explain why its principles should correspond to reality rather than merely functioning as internal rules. You encounter a similar moment when you realize that no argument can validate the reliability of the faculty creating the argument. This recognition is not a failure of thought but an honest observation of its nature. Pain prepared Al-Ghazali for this realization by stripping away the illusion of invulnerability that often accompanies rational achievement. When the mind reaches the edge of its competence, what remains is awareness itself, not the conclusions awareness produces, but the condition that allows conclusions to arise. If reason discovers its own limit, what stands beyond the limit that reason uncovered? After recognizing the limits of the intellect, Al-Ghazali experienced a shift in orientation. Understanding was no longer something he attempted to seize through argument. It became something he prepared himself to receive. The mind cannot force truth to appear. It can only remove the obstacles that prevent clarity from being recognized. You begin to see this when your assumptions fall away. Instead of trying to grasp certainty, you allow certainty to show itself by not interfering with the process. Insight does not arise from conceptual conquest but from quiet receptivity. When the self no longer insists on controlling the meaning of its experiences, understanding emerges without distortion. Pain plays its final role here. It weakens the tendency of the self to cling to its interpretations. When that clinging subsides, the possibility of genuine insight becomes available. If truth is revealed rather than constructed, who is the one who believes it must be sought? As the self's claims weaken, a different quality of awareness begins to appear. It is not dramatic or extraordinary, it is simply free from the filters imposed by desire and fear. Al-Ghazali discovered that certainty does not emerge from intellectual victory but from the dissolution of the one who insists on possessing certainty. When the mind stops defending its conclusions, it stands in a clarity that is not manufactured. You recognize the shift when thought becomes quieter and no longer rushes to complete unfinished patterns. In this space, understanding is not something you hold. It is something that remains when nothing is being defended. Certainty is not a possession but a condition that does not depend on the self. If certainty arises only when the self recedes, what is the nature of the one who knows? You arrive at a point where inquiry completes its task. Reason has revealed its strengths and its limits. Pain has exposed the assumptions that once held your thinking together. Doubt has cleared the ground. What remains is not an answer but a quiet condition in which the need for answers fades. Al-Ghazali's forgotten discipline leads here, to the recognition that truth is not seized by thought but encountered when thought ceases to impose itself. In this stillness, there is no claim, no possession, no insistence. There is only clarity without a claimant. If truth requires no seeker, what remains when even the search falls silent?